A retired Navy SEAL came home after a year away, hoping to surprise his father. But just before entering a grocery store, he saw a familiar figure sitting across the street beside a fruit stand. It was his father, shivering in the winter cold, holding Sable the German Shepherd close.
What
The
are you
SEAL
doing
rushed
sitting out
over
here in
and
the
demanded
snow?
to know
Have
why
you
he was
lost your
sitting there in
mind?
the snow.
His
father tried to
him,
lie,
Brennan, but they
the
took
torn
everything.
coat, paper cup, and
The
tired
company
dog told
owns
the
the
truth.
orchard now.
A powerful company had taken their orchard, their home, and nearly everything he had left. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from, and please like and subscribe to help us reach 1,000 subscribers. The morning Brennan Cole returned to Coldwater Pines, winter did not look cruel. That was the first thing that unsettled him. The northern town lay under a clean, bright sheet of snow, as if God himself had taken a white cloth and laid it gently over every roof, every fence post, every old wound. The lake beyond Main Street held the pale sun like a silver coin. Pines stood along the far ridge, dark and still, their branches heavy with frost. Smoke rose from chimneys in thin blue threads, and the windows of the small shops glowed with the sleepy warmth of a place pretending that nothing bad could happen there. Brennan drove in slowly, both hands steady on the wheel of his black pickup. He had been gone for a year, not gone in the careless way some sons disappear. Brennan had never been careless, not in youth, not in war, not in the quiet years after. He had been working in Alaska as a security training consultant, teaching younger men how to survive bad weather, worse decisions, and the kind of fear that made hands shake at the wrong time. But distance had a strange talent. It could turn love into a schedule, and a schedule into silence. He had told himself he would call when things settled. Things, of course, had not settled. Things rarely did. They only changed their shape and waited to be named. Brennan Cole, at 57, still carried the hard discipline of a retired Navy SEAL. Though age had carved it into something quieter, he stood about 6 feet tall, lean and solid, with the kind of strength built for endurance rather than display. His face was clean-shaven, exposing a square jaw and sharp cheekbones that made him look sterner than he often meant to be. His brown-white hair was cut in a neat military style, just a little longer than strict regulation, as if even time had granted him one small act of freedom. The northern wind had weathered his light skin into a rugged, pale tan, and his grey-blue eyes had the habit of studying the world as if every road, every parked car, every stranger's glance might be trying to confess something. He wore an old tactical combat shirt in dark grey-black olive, softened by years of use, frayed lightly at the cuffs and shoulders, faded from washing and weather. His moss-green combat pants were worn at the knees, the cargo pockets sagging slightly from long use. Old military work boots pressed against the pedals, and an old military watch rested on his wrist like a small, battered oath. On the passenger seat sat a paper grocery list written in his own square handwriting. Coffee beans, cornbread mix, apple butter, vitamins, dog treats. The dog treats made him smile for the first time all morning. Sable would hear the truck before his father did. Brennan could almost see it. The German Shepherd lifting her head by the stove, ears pricking toward the driveway, pretending for half a second to be dignified before betraying herself with that first hard thump of the tail. She had been 5 when he left her with his father, a yellow and black German Shepherd, with a deep chest, sharp upright ears, and amber-brown eyes too intelligent for anyone's comfort. She had never been a noisy dog. Sable watched first, judged second, loved last, but forever. Brennan had left her with Arthur because his father had needed company more than he admitted. Arthur Cole was 82, a former watch repairman whose thin hands had spent a lifetime persuading broken things to move again. Brennan imagined him now inside the old house near the apple orchard, hunched over the work table, white hair falling across his forehead, muttering at a clock spring as if it were a stubborn neighbor. Arthur had always been small beside Brennan, but never fragile. There had been a quiet pride in him, a neatness of soul, as if even hardship should wipe its boots before entering his home. Brennan planned to surprise him. Buy groceries first, drive home, knock like a stranger, watch his father pretend not to cry. It was a simple plan, almost foolishly tender. And because Brennan had spent too much of his life around complicated things, he trusted simple plans most. He parked near Miller's orchard stand, an old fruit shop across from the small grocery store. The building had faded red trim, baskets of winter apples by the door, and a wooden sign that creaked softly in the wind. As a few townspeople moved along the sidewalk, bundled in coats, their boots whispering through fresh snow, Brennan stepped out of the truck and pulled his collar higher against the cold. He had taken only 3 steps toward the grocery store when something across the street caught his eye. At first, he did not understand it. Beneath the awning of the fruit stand, close to the wooden wall where the wind could not strike directly, sat an old man. Snow had gathered on his shoulders, on his faded knit cap, and along the cracked edges of his brown shoes. His coat was patched at one elbow and torn at the other. His hands were red from cold. Near one boot sat a wrinkled paper cup with a few coins inside. But the old man was not holding it out. That detail cut Brennan before recognition did. The cup sat there like an accusation neither the old man nor the world wanted to claim. But beside him lay a German shepherd, yellow and black coat. Deep chest, though thinner than it should have been. Upright ears, black muzzle, amber-brown eyes that moved from passerby to passerby with the tired precision of a guard who had not slept properly in too long. The dog's old brown leather collar was scratched, the small metal nameplate dulled by weather. Sable. Brennan stopped moving. The town continued around him. A woman crossed the street with a sack of flour. A boy in a red hat dragged a sled past the grocery window. Somewhere, a bell over a shop door rang with cheerful stupidity. But Brennan's world had narrowed to the old man under the awning. Arthur Cole sat there with snow on his shoulders. His father. For one suspended second, Brennan's mind tried to protect him. It tried to turn Arthur into someone else. Some stranger with the same small frame. Ushmi. Some other elderly man with white hair and a bowed neck. Some other sorrow that Brennan could witness, pity, and leave behind. Then Sable lifted her head. The dog saw him. She did not bark, did not leap up with joy, did not break into the wild, trembling celebration Brennan had imagined on the long drive south. Instead, Sable rose slowly. Her legs looked stiff from cold. Her body trembled once, not from fear, but from exhaustion held too long. Then she stepped in front of Arthur. Half a step, that was all. But Brennan understood it with the old, sick clarity of a man who had seen sentries hold a line after everyone else had fallen back. Sable was guarding him, not from Brennan perhaps, not truly, but from the world, from embarrassment, from pity, from hands that reached too quickly. From whatever had happened in the year Brennan was gone, Sable looked at Brennan's face, then turned her head toward the road beyond town, the road that led to the Cole apple orchard. Her ears sharpened, her back tightened, a low sound gathered in her chest, not loud enough to frighten anyone nearby, but deep enough for Brennan to feel it in his ribs. She was not simply recognizing him, she was warning him. Brennan crossed the street. Each step felt wrong, too heavy, too late. Snow pressed beneath his boots with soft, accusing crunches. When he reached the awning, Arthur looked up. The old man's face changed in pieces. First came surprise, then joy, bright and helpless. Then shame swept over it like a curtain pulled hard across a window. Arthur Cole was thinner than Brennan remembered. His white hair, once neatly combed, stuck out beneath the old cap in wind-blown wisps. His pale skin had taken on the grey cast of someone who had been cold too often and fed too little. Deep lines folded around his mouth, but his eyes, faded blue, gentle, stubborn, were still his own. That almost made it worse. "Dad," Brennan said. Arthur moved quickly, too quickly for a man his age, and picked up the paper cup. He tucked it against his side as though it were something indecent. "Brennan," he said. His voice was rough, scraped thin by weather. "I didn't know you were coming. I wanted to surprise you." Arthur gave a small smile that failed before it reached his eyes. "Well, you did that." Sable stood between them, but her body had softened. She sniffed Brennan's sleeve once, slowly, carefully. Then she pressed the side of her muzzle against his hand. Only once. The touch nearly broke him. Brennan lowered himself to one knee in the snow because standing over his father suddenly felt like another cruelty. "What are you doing out here?" he asked. Arthur looked toward the street. "Just walking Sable." "Sat down for a bit. Old legs get dramatic in winter." It was a joke, or tried to be. Arthur had always used small jokes, the way poor men used extra blankets. Not enough to solve the cold, but enough to make it bearable. Brennan looked at the torn sleeve, at the coins in the cup, at Sable's ribs showing faintly beneath her winter coat, at the snow crusted along his father's shoes. "If you were just walking," Brennan said quietly, "why are your clothes torn?" Arthur's mouth moved. No answer came. From inside the fruit stand, a woman watched through the glass. Brennan recognized her only after a moment. Ellen Rourke, the owner. She was in her mid-50s, broad-shouldered from years of lifting apple crates, with red hair threaded heavily with silver and a round face that had grown guarded rather than unkind. Ellen had once been loud enough to argue with a thunderstorm. Now she stood behind the counter with one hand pressed to her apron, looking like a woman who had seen something wrong and had spent too long deciding whether fear counted as an excuse. Arthur noticed her watching and lowered his head. That hurt Brennan more than anger would have. His father, who used to fix clocks for widows without charging them. His father, who polished his shoes before church, even when no one came to sit beside him. His father, who had once told Brennan that poverty was not shameful, but dishonesty was. Now he was ashamed of being seen. Brennan removed his old jacket from his shoulders and wrapped it around Arthur before the old man could protest. He kept his hands gentle. That took effort. There was a kind of rage rising in him that wanted a target, a name, a door to kick open. But Arthur was not a battlefield. Arthur was a wounded place. "Come with me," Brennan said. Arthur tried one last time. "I'm all right." Brennan looked directly into his father's eyes. "No," he said softly. "You never were good at lying to me." Something inside Arthur gave way, not dramatically, no great sob, no confession, only a tremor through the shoulders as if an old wall had cracked somewhere behind his ribs. Brennan helped him stand. Sable stayed close to Arthur's knee, pressing her body against him as though she feared the wind might take him too. As Brennan led them toward the black pickup, he heard the fruit stand door open behind him. "Brennan," Ellen called. He turned. Ellen stood beneath the awning now, arms folded tight, flour dust on one sleeve, face pale with the strain of almost speaking. "He didn't put the cup out at first," she said. Arthur closed his eyes. Brennan said nothing. Ellen swallowed. "He came asking for work, sweeping, carrying crates, anything. Said Sable needed food." The words fell into the snow and stayed there. Brennan nodded once, because if he opened his mouth, something in him might come out too sharply and cut the wrong person. He helped Arthur into the passenger seat. Sable climbed in after him and settled with her head near Arthur's knees. Before Brennan closed the truck door, he looked past Main Street toward the road that led to the old Cole orchard. Through the light snow, he saw something that had never been there before. A metal fence, fresh posts, a clean blue and white sign fixed to the gate, North Star Basin Renewal. Brennan stared at the name. He did not know it, but Sable did. Inside the truck, the German shepherd lifted her head and let out that same low, restrained warning. Her amber eyes fixed on the distant road. Brennan closed the door carefully. The story had not begun with a cup of coins. It had begun somewhere beyond that fence, on land his father no longer seemed able to call home. Brennan did not drive toward the old Cole house. For a few minutes, Arthur seemed to expect him to. The old man sat in the passenger seat of the black pickup, with Brennan's jacket wrapped around his shoulders, both hands folded tightly in his lap, as if he were trying to hold himself together by force. Sable lay half on the floorboard and half against Arthur's boots, her yellow and black body curled close, her amber eyes open, watching Brennan through the narrow space between the seats. No one spoke. Outside the windows, Coldwater pines passed by in clean winter colors. White roofs, blue shadows, pine trees heavy with snow. A woman carrying groceries, a child pressing a mittened hand to a bakery window. Ordinary life moved on with that strange confidence. Ordinary life always had, as though grief were a private weather system that did not deserve to trouble the town. Brennan kept his eyes on the road. He had learned long ago that panic often wore the mask of action. Kick the door open. Demand names. Find the man responsible. Break something before something inside you breaks first. But Arthur was sitting beside him, small under the borrowed warmth of Brennan's jacket. Sable had not slept properly in God knew how long. And Brennan understood with a cold, painful clarity that the first rescue was not revenge. The first rescue was warmth. He turned away from the road that would have led toward the orchard and drove to the north edge of town, where the houses thinned into stands of spruce and birch. A small cabin sat there beyond a split-rail fence, its windows glowing gold against the snow. The cabin belonged to Nora Bell. Nora was 71, a widow and retired military nurse, with a compact body, silver-grey hair cut short around her ears, and a face that had been made practical by years of seeing pain arrive without warning. She was not soft in the way people expected kind women to be soft. Her hands were square, her voice dry, and her eyes, pale green beneath heavy lids, missed very little. But Brennan remembered her from childhood as the woman who could clean a cut knee, scold the bleeding boy, and hand him a cookie before he understood he had been comforted. She opened the door before Brennan knocked twice. One glance at Arthur was enough. Nora did not gasp. She did not ask what happened in a tone that would force shame to stand naked in the doorway. She simply stepped aside. "Bring him in," she said. The cabin was small, but it held warmth like a cupped hand. Pine walls, a black iron stove, red checkered curtains, a narrow bed against the far wall, and a round table scarred by old coffee rings. The place smelled of wood smoke, peppermint tea, and clean wool. Outside, winter pressed against the glass. Inside, the fire made a low, steady sound, like an old animal breathing in its sleep. Brennan helped Arthur into the chair nearest the stove. The old man tried to protest that he was fine, but the lie had lost its legs. Nora placed a mug of hot tea into his hands. Arthur's fingers trembled so badly that the liquid shivered near the rim. Sable lowered herself beside him and placed her head across his boots. In the better days, Sable had been magnificent in the way working German shepherds often were. Alert, balanced, built for purpose rather than decoration. At 5 years old, she should have looked powerful in the prime of her body. Instead, hardship had thinned her along the ribs and roughened the thick yellow and black coat around her shoulders. Yet her ears still stood sharp, her black muzzle still lifted at every sound, her eyes still watched the door, the windows, Nora's hands, Brennan's face. Hungry or not, tired or not, Sable still considered Arthur her post. Brennan stood by the stove for a long moment, his old dark grey-black olive tactical shirt still damp at the shoulders from melted snow. The frayed cuffs clung to his wrists. His moss-green combat pants were wet at the knees where he had knelt before his father. He had been trained to enter rooms and understand danger quickly, but this danger did not stand in the open. This danger had already happened. At last, he pulled out the chair across from Arthur and sat down. "What happened to the house?" Brennan asked. Arthur looked at the tea. The old man's face seemed smaller in the firelight. His white hair lay thin and uneven beneath the knit cap Nora had not yet made him remove. His cheeks were hollow, his skin pale with cold, and his eyes held the terrible weariness of a man who had spent too long hiding pain in order not to inconvenience anyone. He did not answer immediately. Brennan waited. That was harder than speaking. But Arthur deserved time. A man who had lost his home should not have his story dragged from him like evidence from a crime scene. Finally, Arthur said, "I thought I was doing something sensible." The words came out so quietly that Nora, standing near the counter, looked down and busied herself with the kettle. She understood dignity well enough to give it privacy. Arthur spoke of a man named Graham Voss. He said the name without anger at first, and that disturbed Brennan more than hatred would have. Hatred meant the wound had found its enemy. Shame meant the wound still blamed itself. Graham, Arthur said, had come to him in early spring. He had not looked like a thief. He had looked like the sort of man who belonged on committees, in clean offices, beside ribbon cuttings and polished plaques. Graham Voss was in his early 50s, tall and narrow, with silver-blonde hair combed neatly back, pale eyes and a calm, handsome face that seemed practiced in sympathy. He wore good wool coats, leather gloves, and scarves that looked too soft for a town where most people dressed to survive weather rather than impress it. He represented a development group called North Star Basin Renewal. "A winter eco-resort," Arthur said, still staring into the tea. "Walking paths by the lake. A small market. Cabins. Jobs for young people." They said they wanted to preserve the old orchards, not destroy them. Coldwater pines had been dying slowly for years. Brennan knew that much. The mill had closed. The school had shrunk. Storefronts changed hands and then went dark. A promise of work could make decent people forgive the smell of a trap, especially if the trap arrived carrying blueprints and polite language. Arthur had not agreed at first. "Our land was your mother's heart," he said. At the mention of Evelyn Cole, Brennan felt the room shift. His mother had been gone 11 years, but there were names that did not leave a house when the body did. Evelyn had planted the first apple tree behind the home, back when Brennan was still young enough to believe trees grew because mothers told them to. She had laughed easily, worn blue sweaters, and had a habit of touching Arthur's shoulder whenever she passed him. As though love were a lamp she kept relighting. Arthur swallowed. Graham kept saying the Cole name would stay. He said there would be a memorial marker near the orchard, said people would know your mother helped make it possible. Brennan said nothing. Sable lifted her head. For the first time since they entered the cabin, the dog's attention moved away from the door and fixed on Arthur's coat hanging over the chair beside the stove. Her ears tilted forward. Her nose worked slowly, catching some faint thread of scent hidden beneath smoke, wool, and snow. Arthur continued. Graham had offered money. Not a fortune by city standards, perhaps, but more than Arthur had ever expected to see at once. Enough to repair the old roof. Enough to settle medical bills left from Evelyn's final year. Enough, Graham had said gently, for Arthur to leave something behind for Brennan. That was how he said it, Arthur whispered. Like I was being a good father. Then came the papers. At first, Arthur had been shown what he understood to be a temporary survey agreement. 90 days. Permission to measure land, study soil, inspect old water lines. Nothing about selling, nothing about surrendering the house. A town clerk had copied the early version for him, though Arthur could not remember now whether he still had it. A few days later, Graham returned and said the first copy had errors. Too much legal clutter, he called it. The corrected version had to be signed before a weather delay pushed the project into spring. On the day of the signing, Arthur's back had been bad. The kind of pain that made the world narrow. His reading glasses were not in his pocket where he always kept them. Graham told him not to worry. Just routine language, just protection, just making sure Brennan would not inherit trouble. Here Arthur stopped, his hand tightened around the mug. Sable rose, not suddenly, not dramatically, but with purpose. She walked to the old coat hanging over the chair, pressed her nose against the lower pocket, and held still. A faint sound came from her chest. Not a growl, not a whine, but something in between. A memory caught in an animal's throat. Brennan watched her. Arthur watched her too. For several seconds, the cabin seemed to listen with them. Then Arthur said, "She did that after they took me out of the house. Kept smelling that pocket. I thought she was looking for food." Brennan's eyes moved to the coat. A strange chill passed through him, though the stove was burning hot. He did not touch it yet. Not while Arthur was still speaking. After the signing, the money did not arrive the way Graham had promised. A portion appeared, then vanished into a banking dispute Arthur did not understand. Notices followed. Then strangers came to the house. Men in work jackets. A woman with a clipboard. A polite explanation that the property was now under transition. Arthur had 48 hours to remove personal items from the residence. "I told them it was a mistake," Arthur said. Graham said mistakes were exactly why I should let him handle it calmly. Calmly. The word struck Brennan like an insult dressed for church. Arthur had tried to call him. The phone service was cut after missed payments tied to the frozen account. He had written 2 letters by hand. Someone from the project office offered to mail them. No letters reached Brennan. Arthur's voice grew smaller. "After a while I thought maybe it was better. You had your own life. I kept thinking I could fix it before you knew." Brennan rose and walked to the window. Outside the snow was falling again, soft and beautiful, the way Mercy might look if Mercy had no memory. His reflection stared back at him from the glass. Grey-blue eyes, clean-shaven jaw clenched tight, the face of a man trying not to become dangerous in front of his father. Behind him, Arthur said, "I was stupid." Brennan turned. No, Arthur flinched at the force in the word. Brennan softened his voice, but not the truth inside it. "You were not stupid. You were alone. There is a difference. The old man's mouth trembled. Nora, still by the counter, looked away. Even Sable seemed to go still, as though the sentence had put a hand on something wounded in the room. Brennan crossed back to the chair and knelt in front of his father. He had knelt in snow, mud, sand, and blood in his life. But never had kneeling felt more necessary. "You tried to protect me," he said. "Someone used that." Arthur closed his eyes. But a tear slipped down one weathered cheek, and he wiped it away quickly, embarrassed by his own humanity. Later, after Nora insisted Arthur eat soup and wrapped a blanket around his shoulders, the old man finally drifted into a shallow sleep by the stove. His head leaned back, mouth slightly open, hands resting loose in his lap. For the first time since Brennan had found him, Arthur did not look like he was bracing for the next humiliation. Sable waited until the room had settled, then she stood again. She went to Arthur's old coat and nosed the torn pocket with quiet insistence. Brennan moved slowly this time. He reached into the pocket and felt lining loose thread, a hard crumb of old bread, and then something caught in the torn seam. He pulled it free, a small piece of green fabric. It was stiff with dried oil and carried a sharp scent of machinery and pine resin. Along one edge, in white thread, were 3 letters, NBR. Brennan held it under the lamplight. Nora came closer, her face tightening. Sable sat beside Arthur and stared at the cloth, ears forward, body still as carved stone. Brennan did not yet know whose sleeve it had come from. He did not yet know what door it would open. But he knew one thing with absolute certainty. Sable had remembered what men hoped an old man would forget. And in the warm little cabin, while snow covered cold-water pines like a blessing too clean for the truth beneath it, Brennan Cole folded the green cloth into his palm and felt the first hard shape of the fight ahead. Before dawn, Brennan Cole was already awake. The cabin had settled into that deep northern silence that came before morning, when even the trees seemed to hold their breath beneath the weight of snow. The fire in the iron stove had sunk low, glowing red behind the grate. Arthur slept in the chair near it, wrapped in a wool blanket Nora Bell had left over his shoulders. His head leaned slightly to one side, his thin white hair catching the last amber light from the coals. Sable lay beneath his chair. The 5-year-old German shepherd had not fully slept. Her yellow and black body was curled tight, but one amber eye opened whenever the cabin boards creaked, whenever the wind brushed snow against the window, whenever Arthur's breathing changed. Hunger had narrowed her frame, and cold had roughened the fur along her shoulders, but something in her remained unbroken. She watched over Arthur the way a lighthouse watched a black sea, not because it could stop the storm, but because it refused to go dark. Brennan stood at the small table with a pencil in his hand. He had slept less than an hour. Anger moved inside him, but not like fire. Fire was wild. Fire wasted itself. What Brennan felt was colder and heavier, like a lake freezing from the edges inward. It pressed against his ribs, asked for a name, asked for a target. Graham Voss, North Star Basin Renewal. The men who had pushed his father out. The people who had looked away. But Brennan was old enough to know that a man could ruin justice by rushing toward it. If he stormed into North Star's office, Graham would have him framed before sundown. Unstable veteran, angry son, violent threat. If Brennan shouted, people would stop hearing the truth and start watching his hands. If he broke a door, they would make the broken door the story instead of the stolen home. So he did what he had once done before every mission. He built a map. On a sheet of brown wrapping paper Nora had found in a drawer, Brennan drew 3 columns. Dates, events, names. He wrote carefully, the pencil moving in straight, hard strokes. No drama, no poetry, no revenge, just order. Arthur woke to the sound. For a moment, the old man looked lost, as if waking in a borrowed cabin required him to suffer the truth all over again. Then his eyes found Sable beneath the chair, then Brennan at the table, and the shame returned, not loudly, not with tears, but with that small lowering of the gaze that hurt Brennan more than any confession could have. "Coffee?" Brennan asked. Arthur nodded. He sat at the table with both hands around the mug, steam rising between his fingers. Those hands had once repaired pocket watches, mantel clocks, and delicate little wristwatches brought in by half the town. Now they trembled when he lifted the cup. Still, Brennan noticed the old habit. Arthur turned the mug handle to the right before drinking, as if even in ruin, order mattered. Brennan did not begin with accusations. He began with time. When did Graham first come by? Arthur thought. After the last thaw, maybe April. Was he alone? First time, yes. Later he brought people. What people? Arthur closed his eyes, searching memory like a man feeling for a light switch in a dark room. A woman with a folder once, a young man in a work jacket, another fellow who kept looking at the trees, not the house. Brennan wrote it down. He asked about the first document Arthur had seen, asked where it was copied, asked when the reading glasses disappeared, asked who came on the day the locks changed, asked when Sable began favoring her back leg. At that question, Arthur's mouth tightened. Sable lifted her head. Brennan saw it. The dog had heard something in his tone, or maybe in Arthur's silence. Arthur stared into his coffee. She tried to stop them. Brennan's pencil stopped moving. They came with a truck, Arthur said. Said some things had to be cleared from the porch. I told them there had been a mistake. Sable stood in front of the steps, not biting, not snarling, just standing. One of the men shoved her with his knee and the side of a crate. She slipped on the ice. Brennan's grip on the pencil tightened until the wood nearly cracked. Arthur kept his eyes down. She limped for days. Sable's ears angled back, not in fear but in memory. The dog shifted closer to Arthur's boot and rested her chin across it. "And Graham?" Brennan asked. "He put his hand on my shoulder." Arthur's voice thinned. Said if I made a scene, people would say I couldn't control the dog. There it was again. Graham's kind of violence. No bruise where people could see, no raised fist, just a sentence placed exactly where an old man was weakest. Brennan wrote the words down, then he underlined them once. By mid-morning, Brennan left Arthur in Nora's care and drove back into town with Sable beside him. He did not want to leave his father, but Arthur had given him a look that said, "Go." The old man still had pride enough to understand when pain needed a witness and when it needed work. Their first stop was Miller's orchard stand. Ellen Rourke was stacking crates of winter apples near the front window when Brennan walked in. In daylight, she looked more tired than she had the day before. She was in her mid-50s, broad through the shoulders from years of lifting produce, with red hair heavily threaded with silver and a face that seemed built for laughter but trained by hardship into caution. Her hands were rough, her apron stained with flour and apple skin, and her eyes carried the burden of someone who had done a little kindness, then hated herself for not doing more. She looked at Sable first. The dog stood quietly beside Brennan's leg, no growling, no begging, just watching. "I fed her when I could," Ellen said before Brennan asked anything. "I know," Ellen swallowed. "No, you don't. Not all of it." So he listened. Arthur had not come to the fruit stand asking for money, not at first. He came asking to sweep, to carry crates, to shovel the walk after snow, anything that would let him earn food for Sable without saying the word hunger. Ellen had tried to give him work. Then Graham's people began saying Arthur was confused, that he might fall, that there could be liability if anyone let him lift or sweep. "Liability," Ellen said bitterly. "That's a fancy word for making a decent man useless." The paper cup had not been Arthur's idea. A customer had dropped coins into it one morning. Arthur had been too tired, too cold, and too ashamed to remove it. Brennan stood very still. There were humiliations that struck like a fist. Others worked like frostbite. Quiet. Gradual. By the time the damage showed, something had already gone numb. Outside, Sable turned her head suddenly toward the north end of the street, not toward the fruit stand, not toward the cabin, toward the municipal building. Her ears rose. Brennan followed her gaze. Across the square, a grey stone building sat behind two bare maples. Town offices, records, permits, copies, paper. Sable took one slow step toward it, then stopped and looked back at him. Ellen noticed. Her face changed. "That dog," she said softly, "knows more than half this town wants to." The sentence settled into Brennan like a bell struck under ice. Not a clue exactly, not proof, not magic. Just a faithful animal facing a building full of paper, as if memory itself had found a door. By afternoon, Brennan had called Harlan Creed. Harlan arrived from Duluth in an old dark SUV dusted white with road salt. He was 64, tall in a narrow weathered way, with short silver hair, a high forehead, and a face that looked as if it had been sharpened by disappointment rather than age. A thin scar ran from his left cheekbone toward his jaw, half hidden unless the light caught it. He walked with a slight limp from an old injury and carried a leather folder under one arm. His grey-brown eyes were dry, exacting, and almost rude in their refusal to be impressed. Years ago, Harlan had worked in military legal support before becoming a civilian investigator. He had the temperament of a man who trusted documents only after they had been forced to tell the truth. He looked at Brennan, then at Sable, then at Arthur's notes spread across the cabin table. "If you want revenge," Harlan said, "I'll turn around and drive home." Brennan said nothing. "If you want to win," Harlan continued, "we start with copies." They went to the town office before closing. The records room smelled of old paper, floor cleaner, and radiators. Behind the counter sat Lena Pike, the town clerk. Lena was 61, small and straight-backed, with brown-grey hair cut neatly at her jaw and black-framed glasses that made her pale eyes seem more guarded than they were. She wore a dark plum cardigan over a white blouse, buttoned to the throat. Everything on her desk was aligned perfectly. Stapler, date stamp, pen cup, stack of forms. She looked like a woman who believed order could protect her from being asked moral questions. Harlan asked for property filings. Brennan asked about the early survey agreement Arthur had copied there. Lena's hand paused over the keyboard. Only for a second, but Brennan saw it. "I process many documents," she said. Harlan gave her a dry look. "That sounds like a sentence people use when they remember one in particular." Lena's mouth tightened. Sable stood beside Brennan, calm but alert, her nose lifted toward the corner where an old photocopier sat under a yellowing sign that read, "Out of order, use front desk machine." The dog did not bark, she only stared. Lena followed Sable's gaze and looked away too quickly. Brennan felt the map in his mind add a new mark, not proof, but pressure. They left with publicly available filing dates, ownership transfer references, and enough corporate names for Harlan to begin digging. By evening, in the cabin, Harlan had spread printed pages across the table. North Star Basin Renewal was not a simple resort company. It was layered under several smaller entities. One of them had applied for geothermal exploration access near Coldwater Pines. Arthur sat silently when Brennan explained it. "The Warm Creek," Arthur said. "What?" "Behind the orchard. Snow never held there for long. Evelyn called it the earth-breathing." Brennan looked at Harlan. Harlan tapped the page. "Your father didn't just have land, he had access." That night, Brennan did not sleep again. Sable didn't either. Near midnight, the dog rose from beside Arthur's chair and stood facing the cabin door. Her body was tense, but she made no sound. Brennan opened the door and stepped into the cold. Sable moved ahead through the snow, not running, not dragging him, simply following some remembered path. Brennan followed at a distance, coat collar high, phone in his pocket, every sense awake. They stopped near the edge of the old Cole orchard. Beyond a line of trees behind temporary fencing, blue work lights glowed in the dark. Several figures moved around a compact drilling rig. A white truck idled near the gate. Metal clinked softly under the winter sky. Brennan's first instinct was to go in. Harlan, who had followed more slowly and quietly than his limp suggested, caught his sleeve. "Not tonight." Brennan did not look away from the lights. "They're on my father's land." "Then let them prove it on camera." Brennan breathed once, twice. And then he took out his phone and recorded everything. The lights, the rig, the truck, the time, the fence line, the men moving where his mother's apple trees once stood in peace. Sable stood beside him, silent in the snow. For the first time since he had come home, Brennan understood that patience was not weakness. Sometimes patience was a blade still in its sheath, and tonight he would not swing it, he would sharpen it. The video from the night before did not feel like victory. It sat on Brennan Cole's phone in a clean row of cold facts. Blue work lights, men moving behind fencing, a compact drilling rig turning beneath the winter sky, a white truck idling near the old orchard road. The footage was clear enough to trouble a conscience, but not strong enough to break a lie. Harlan Creed watched it twice at Nora Bell's cabin, his narrow face lit by the phone screen, his silver hair catching the morning light from the window. "It helps," Harlan said. Brennan stood across from him, arms folded, jaw tight. "That doesn't sound like enough." "It isn't." Arthur sat by the stove with Sable pressed close to his chair. The old man looked smaller that morning, as if every new piece of truth made him feel responsible for more damage. His hands rested over the blanket, fingers bent and thin, the same hands that had once repaired clocks so delicate. Brennan had been afraid to breathe near them. Harlan set the phone down. "North Star will say they had survey rights," he said. "Maybe temporary, maybe contested, maybe misunderstood, but they will say they were allowed to be there. If we want to prove something worse, we need people, not guesses. People who saw pieces of this before they decided silence was safer." Brennan hated how reasonable that sounded. He had spent much of his life in places where danger declared itself plainly. A muzzle flash, a shouted warning, a wire where no wire should be. Here, danger wore a wool coat and filed paperwork. Here, cruelty did not kick indoors. It made the victim sign for the key. Harlan seemed to read the thought on his face. "Debated men like Graham Voss don't win because nobody sees them," he said. "They win because everybody sees one small piece and tells themselves it isn't enough to matter." So they began with the small pieces. Their first stop was the white church above the lake road. The building stood modestly against the snow, with a steeple too small to impress anyone and stained glass windows that held more blue than red. Inside, it smelled of old hymnals, polished wood, and soup served too many times in the basement to people too proud to admit they were hungry. Reverend Caleb Wren met them near the front pew. Caleb was 68, tall and thin, with a stooped back and a long, patient face, framed by a ring of white hair around a bald crown. His skin was pale, almost translucent in the winter light, and his blue eyes had the tired kindness of a man who had buried friends, married strangers, and carried casseroles into homes where grief had forgotten how to cook. He was gentle, but not weak. There was a difference Brennan respected at once. "Yes," Caleb said, when Brennan asked about Arthur. "He stayed here 3 nights. Arthur looked down. Caleb did not make him feel small by pitying him. He simply continued. "He refused the cot the first night, said it was for someone who needed it worse. I told him if I found that person, I'd ask them to share." A faint, broken smile passed over Arthur's face. Caleb led them to the side room behind the fellowship hall. It was plain. A folded cot, a metal chair, a box of canned goods, a faded painting of Jesus with sheep. Sable entered slowly, nose low, her yellow and black body moving with careful memory. "She stayed there," Caleb said, pointing to the door. "Never slept in the middle of the room, always by the exit." Brennan watched Sable sniff the threshold. "Was she afraid?" Caleb shook his head. "No, that dog wasn't afraid. She was waiting." The words landed heavily. Then Caleb mentioned the back parking lot. "There was a white truck some nights," he said. "No markings, I noticed. It would sit beyond the alley with its lights off. I assumed it was connected to the work crews. At the time, I did not want to make trouble out of shadows." He looked at Arthur when he said it. "I am sorry for that." Arthur opened his mouth as if to excuse him, because Arthur had spent his whole life making other people more comfortable with the pain they had caused him. Brennan placed a hand lightly on his father's shoulder before he could speak. Some apologies deserved to stand unrescued. From the church, they went to Arlen Pharmacy, a narrow brick shop on Main Street with a green awning and a bell that rang too cheerfully when they entered. Tom Arlen, the pharmacist, was 66, short and narrow-shouldered, with a white moustache trimmed close and thick glasses that magnified his worried brown eyes. He wore a pale blue shirt under his white coat, and his hands moved with the careful precision of a man who counted pills the way priests counted beads. He was not dramatic, he was not brave in any obvious way, but he had the soul of a record-keeper, and sometimes that was the closest thing a small town had to justice. When Harlan asked about Arthur's prescriptions, Tom's face tightened. "I can't give private medical details without proper authorization," he said. Arthur reached into his coat and signed the release Harlan had prepared. Tom looked cornered by procedure, which was perhaps the only kind of corner he understood. He checked the computer, then an old pickup log in a binder behind the counter. His finger stopped on a date. "Mr. Voss picked up your pain medication that afternoon," Tom said, looking at Arthur. "He said you were waiting in the car and your back was bad." Arthur frowned, trying to remember. "I don't think I was in his car then." Tom's face lost color. No one said the larger thing aloud. They did not have to. If Graham had collected Arthur's medication before or near the signing, the timing mattered. Not because medicine alone could steal a house, but because pressure liked company. Pain, confusion, missing glasses, urgent language, a trusted voice. Harlan copied the date. Brennan felt the map grow sharper. By noon, they had enough fragments to make the truth more solid and more painful. A church room, a white truck, a pharmacy pickup, a missing pair of glasses, a dog shoved from a porch, a father taught to feel foolish for needing help, but fragments were not enough. Then Sable stopped outside the coffee shop. The place was called the Tin Kettle, a warm little room with fogged windows and mismatched chairs. Brennan had meant only to pass it. Sable did not. She stood at the window, ears forward, amber eyes fixed on a woman seated alone near the back. The woman looked up. Her face changed before Brennan knew her name. Not a bark, not a chase, not proof. Just a dog staring through glass at someone whose conscience recognized her before her mouth could lie. Inside, the woman began gathering her papers too quickly. Brennan entered before she could leave. She was in her mid-30s, with shoulder-length brown hair tied low and loose, a tired, intelligent face, and grey-blue eyes shadowed by sleeplessness. She wore a dark green technical parka with a small North Star logo at the chest, a grey thermal shirt, black outdoor pants, and brown snow boots marked with salt. On the back of her right hand was a thin, pale scar. "Mara Finch?" Harlan asked. Her eyes moved from Harlan to Brennan, then down to Sable. The scarred hand curled into a fist. "I don't know anything that can help you," she said. Brennan pulled out a chair but did not sit. "That sounds like something a person says when knowing has become expensive." Mara's mouth tightened. "I joined North Star because this town needed work. My father lost his job when the lumber mill shut down. I watched good men sell tools they had owned for 30 years. I watched families leave because hope got too expensive to keep." Her voice shook, but not with weakness. With anger at the possibility that her good intentions had been used to pave a road over someone else's life. "I believed in the project," she said. "I still believe Coldwater Pines needs something." "So did my father," Brennan said. "That's why it worked." The sentence struck her. Sable took one step closer. Mara looked at the dog, not at the teeth, not at the ears, at the eyes. "She scratched me," Mara whispered. Brennan went still. When they came to clear the porch, Mara said, "Sable tried to stay between Arthur and the work crew. She wasn't attacking. She was just standing there. Doyle pushed a crate into her path. I reached down to catch her collar before someone got hurt, and she twisted. Her nail caught my hand. Her eyes filled, though she fought it. I told myself I was helping, keeping the situation controlled. That's what we called everything. Controlled." Harlan sat down now, slow and deliberate. "What did Graham know?" he asked. Mara looked toward the window where winter light made the whole town look innocent. He knew Arthur didn't understand the final packet. Arthur, who had said almost nothing all morning, closed his eyes. Mara continued, voice low. "There was a meeting in the field trailer. Graham said Arthur only had to believe he was protecting his son from future burdens. He said elderly owners sign faster when the sacrifice feels noble." Brennan's hands flexed once. Sable leaned against Arthur's knee under the table, as if bracing him against the sentence. "Is there a recording?" Harlan asked. Mara hesitated. The trailer had a camera system. Sometimes meetings were recorded because half the legal team called in remotely. "I don't have access now. The trailer is being moved for the winter festival. They're turning it into a display booth about the orchard restoration." Brennan stared at her. Mara's shame deepened. "They're calling it the Cole Heritage Exhibit," she said. For the first time that day, Arthur made a sound. Not a word, something smaller. A breath injured on its way out. Graham was not merely taking the land. He was preparing to hang Arthur's family history like decoration over the theft. Back at Nora's cabin, Arthur began to fold inward. He sat on the edge of the bed, hands hanging between his knees, eyes fixed on the floorboards. The day had given them more truth, but it had also given Arthur more reasons to blame himself. That was the cruelty of manipulation, even when exposed. It left its victim holding the shame. "Maybe the town needs it," Arthur said. Brennan looked up from the notes. Arthur's voice was thin. "The jobs, the visitors, the money. Maybe one old man's mistake shouldn't stand in the way of all that." Brennan had no easy answer. He could fight men, he could outweight pain, he could look at a hostile room and find the exits. But he did not know how to pull self-hatred out of his father without tearing something. Sable did. The dog rose from beside the stove, crossed the room, and lowered herself beneath the narrow bed. For a moment, there was only the sound of her claws against wood. Then she backed out carefully, holding something in her mouth. Arthur's breath caught. It was a pocket watch, old silver, scratched at the edges, attached to a short chain. Evelyn Cole's watch. Arthur had carried it after she died, winding it each Sunday evening as if keeping time for the woman he still loved. He must have hidden it in his coat when they forced him from the house, then lost track of it during the cold days that followed. Sable placed it gently at Arthur's feet. The old man picked it up with both hands. His thumbs moved over the case. Something was tucked behind the back plate, where a watch repairman might hide a note no one else would think to search for. Arthur opened it. A tiny folded paper slipped into his palm. Brennan leaned closer. In Arthur's careful handwriting were 5 words: Lena Pike, copy before seal. Arthur stared at the note for a long time. Then memory returned, not like lightning, but like a small lamp being lit in a room everyone thought was empty. "I asked Lena to copy the first agreement," he whispered, "before Graham brought the final one, before the seal, before everything changed." Harlan's eyes sharpened. Brennan looked at the old watch in his father's hands and felt the room tilt toward hope. The first real proof had not come from force. It had come from an old man's habit of preserving time, and from a dog who still knew where love had been hidden. By morning, the little note Arthur had hidden years of habit inside had changed the weight of the room. No one spoke of miracles. Brennan Cole did not trust easy words, and Harlan Creed had the face of a man who would object to a miracle unless it came with a signed affidavit. But even Harlan handled the note carefully, as if a fragile thing could still carry the strength of an old bridge. Lena Pike, copy before seal. Those words did not prove everything, but they gave memory an address. Arthur dressed slowly. Nora Bell had mended one torn sleeve of his brown-grey coat before dawn. The stitches neat and stubborn, the way Nora did everything. She said nothing sentimental as she worked. Nora, at 71, with cropped silver-grey hair, pale green eyes, and the square hands of a retired military nurse, believed tenderness should often arrive disguised as usefulness. She handed Arthur the coat, brushed a loose thread from the shoulder, and said, "Stand straight if you can. If you can't, stand anyway." Arthur almost smiled. Sable stayed close as they left the cabin. The 5-year-old German shepherd moved with quiet purpose, her yellow and black coat brushed by Brennan until some of its old shine returned. She was still too thin. Her ribs did not show badly, but Brennan could feel the absence of good meals under his hand. Yet her ears stood sharp, and her amber eyes carried that grave loyalty that made strangers mistake silence for danger. Brennan drove them to the town office with Harlan beside him and Arthur in the back seat with Sable. The black pickup moved through Coldwater Pines under a pale sky. The town looked awake now, but not innocent. People paused on sidewalks. A man at the bakery window watched them pass and quickly looked away. A woman sweeping snow from her steps whispered something to another woman in a red coat. Brennan saw all of it. Small towns did not need newspapers to spread judgment. They had windows. At the municipal building, Lena Pike was already behind her desk. She looked smaller than Brennan remembered from the day before. Lena was 61, with a narrow frame, brown-grey hair cut bluntly at the jaw, and black-framed glasses that made her face seem even more severe. She wore a dark plum cardigan over a white blouse buttoned to the throat, a grey wool skirt and sensible brown shoes polished to a dull shine. Every object on her desk sat in perfect alignment. The stapler, the date stamp, the file tray, the pens. Order, Brennan thought, was her armor, but armor could become a cage if a person wore it long enough. Lena looked up. Her eyes went first to Brennan, then to Harlan, then to Arthur. Finally, they dropped to Arthur's hands. He was not holding the note where she could see it. He was holding himself. That seemed to trouble her more. "Mr. Cole," she said, "I didn't expect you." Arthur stepped forward. His back was a little bent, but his voice did not bend with it. "I didn't come to accuse you, Lena." That shook her. Brennan had expected anger to open the door. Arthur opened it with mercy instead, and somehow that made the room more unbearable. Lena's mouth tightened. "I don't know what I can tell you." Harlan placed a folder on the counter. "You can start with the first agreement, the one before North Star's final packet." Lena glanced toward the back office. "Records requests go through formal channels." Harlan gave a thin smile. "Wonderful. I adore channels, especially when they don't become moats." Arthur reached into his coat and placed a small folded paper on the counter. Not the old note itself, but a copy Harlan had made at the cabin. Lena stared at the words. Color left her face. For a long moment, the only sound was the radiator ticking beneath the window. Then Arthur said softly, "Your husband brought me his wedding watch once." Lena closed her eyes. Brennan watched something old move across her face. Not fear, grief. "He dropped it on the church steps," Arthur continued, "cracked the crystal, bent the stem. You were both going to your granddaughter's service that morning." Lena's hands tightened on the edge of the desk. "You fixed it by noon," she whispered. "You tried to pay me. You wouldn't let me." Arthur nodded. "I don't need payment now. I need the truth." Lena looked at him then, really looked. Not at the ruined man people had whispered about. Not at the old homeowner tangled in paperwork. At Arthur Cole, the man who had once repaired time for her on the worst morning of her life. Her voice broke in a quiet place. The first paper was not a transfer. Harlan's eyes sharpened. Lena opened a drawer and removed a key. She stood, moving like a woman walking toward a sentence she had postponed too long, and led them to the records room. It smelled of dust, paper, and machines that had grown old doing unglamorous work. In the corner sat the old photocopier Sable had stared at the day before. Lena touched the machine with 2 fingers. "I copied a short agreement for Arthur," she said. 90-day survey access, soil and water study, no sale, no relocation clause, no mineral or geothermal assignment. He wanted to read it at home, did he? Brennan asked. He tried. Lena swallowed. 2 days later, Graham Voss came in, said the version I copied had drafting errors and should not be circulated. He took the paper Arthur had brought back and told me all future revisions would be handled directly through North Star's office. Did that seem normal? Harlan asked. No. Lena's face hardened with shame. But the town was desperate. North Star was promising money for the rescue station, the children's rink, the library roof. Graham made doubt feel like sabotage. The words hung there. Not an excuse, not enough, but human. Lena had not kept the paper copy. But the photocopier had an internal storage drive, and the town's newer machine had not yet fully replaced it. Harlan called a licensed digital records technician from the county, a quiet man named Russell Dane, 58, broad-bellied, balding, with a grey beard trimmed close, and the patient irritation of someone who had spent half his life explaining computers to people who feared them. Russell wore a brown canvas jacket and carried a hard case of tools. He did not ask about the family drama, he only asked who had authorization. Lena signed. It took nearly 3 hours. Arthur sat on a bench in the hall, Sable's head resting on his knee. Brennan stood near the window, watching snow lift off the sidewalk in small, ghostly swirls. Every minute stretched, not because they had nothing, but because they might have almost enough, and almost enough was a dangerous kind of hope. At last, Russell stepped out of the records room. Recovered one relevant scan, he said. Harlan took the printed copy. The agreement was 3 pages long. 3, not 19, not folded into a packet, not buried beneath legal language thick enough to drown an old man. Arthur looked at it and covered his mouth with one hand. That's it, he said. That's the one. Brennan saw his father's shoulders shake once, not from weakness, but from the violent relief of learning that memory had not betrayed him. Harlan compared it with the transfer references on file. His expression did not change much, but his voice lowered. "This doesn't win the war," he said, "but it proves there were two stories, the one your father was shown, and the one North Star used." That afternoon, Graham Voss answered without entering the room. A post appeared on the Coldwater Pines community page. The words were polished, sorrowful, and poisonous. It did not name Arthur cruelly. It did not need to. It spoke of misunderstandings, outside agitation, and a returning former military contractor struggling with guilt over family matters. It warned that reckless accusations could endanger the North Star project, putting jobs, public funding, and the Winter Festival partnership at risk. By sunset, the town had begun to divide. Not loudly, that was worse. A man at the gas station stopped talking when Brennan entered. Two women outside the bakery looked at Arthur and then down at their bags. Someone taped a small printed flyer to the community board. "Don't let anger cost Coldwater its future." Arthur read it through the truck window. His face went still. Back at the cabin, he sat by the stove and said, "Maybe they're right." Brennan turned from the counter. Arthur's voice was tired beyond age. Maybe one old man's mistake is too expensive for a whole town to carry. Before Brennan could answer, there was a knock at the door. Deputy Iris Vale stood outside. She was 42, compact and strong, with auburn brown hair tied low at the nape of her neck, and a face made practical by weather and disappointment. Her skin was fair but reddened by cold, and her grey-blue eyes had the wary focus of someone who had learned to listen before choosing sides. She wore a dark navy duty jacket over a grey thermal shirt, black tactical pants, a neat duty belt, and snow-dusted black boots. She removed her hat when she entered. Not for Brennan, for Arthur. "I saw the post," she said. "And I saw the scan." Harlan raised an eyebrow. "That was fast." "Small town," Iris replied. "Bad news runs, truth limps." Small but sharp. The first person in uniform had not come with a warrant, not with rescue, not with a grand promise. She had come because one recovered paper and one public lie had finally made silence feel heavier than duty. Iris did not offer comfort, she offered limits. "I can't seize North Star property because a family is angry," she said. "But if there is reason to believe evidence is being moved or destroyed, and if someone with direct knowledge provides a statement, I can request a temporary hold while we review it with county." Brennan understood. But Mara Finch was not ready when Brennan found her near the service road behind North Star's temporary office. She stood beside her parked Subaru, arms wrapped around herself, the North Star logo on her green parka half covered by her scarf as if she could hide from the thing she worked for. "I can't be the reason the project collapses," she said. "You won't be," Brennan answered. "Graham will." Her eyes filled, but she shook her head. "That's easy for you to say. My father died believing this town had no future because nobody invested in it. I wanted to prove him wrong." Sable stood beside Arthur, who had insisted on coming. The dog looked at Mara with no accusation. Somehow that was worse. Mara's gaze dropped to Sable's face, then to the scar on her own hand. "I know where the trailer is being moved," she whispered, "but I don't have legal access to the files." "We're not stealing files," Harlan said. "We're preserving evidence." Mara looked toward the equipment yard. "Oh, there's a driver," she said. "Doyle Mercer. He moved the trailer. He knows Graham ordered it out early." They found Doyle behind the maintenance shed, smoking beside a snowplow. Doyle Mercer was 39, thick through the shoulders and soft around the middle, with wind-burned cheeks, tired brown eyes, and a few days' worth of uneven stubble. He wore a dark green North Star work jacket, dusty at the sleeves, a grey hoodie, brown canvas pants, black knit cap, and heavy boots caked with frozen mud. He looked less like a villain than a man who had spent years letting need make his decisions smaller. When he saw Sable, the cigarette fell from his hand. "I didn't hurt her bad," he said immediately. Arthur flinched. Doyle's face crumpled. "I told myself the papers were done. I told myself he sold. I got a kid with medical bills. Graham pays on time." Brennan did not move closer. Sable did. She walked up to Doyle and stood in front of him. No growl, no teeth, just the silent gaze of an animal who remembered the shape of a shove and still did not become cruel. That undid him. Doyle pressed both hands over his face. "I moved the trailer this morning, Disney," he said. "Festival Square. Graham told me not to let maintenance check the old camera unit. Said it was obsolete and going to storage after the booth." Harlan took out a statement form. Doyle signed with a shaking hand. By dusk, Deputy Iris Vale had enough to request a temporary evidence hold on the trailer, citing a property dispute, recovered conflicting documents, and a sworn statement that potentially relevant recording equipment was being moved before review. It was not a victory yet, but it was the first time the system had turned its face, however slightly, toward Arthur. Outside, the town prepared for the winter festival, stringing lights between trees, raising booths, painting hope across plywood. Inside the cabin, Arthur watched Sable sleep at his feet and whispered, "What if Graham knows?" Brennan looked out toward the distant glow of the square. "He does," Harlan said from the table. No one argued. The festival was one day away, and somewhere beneath all that music, cider, and bright winter ribbon, a man who built lies for a living had just learned that one of them had begun to breathe against him. The winter festival arrived looking too beautiful for the truth it was about to carry. Coldwater Pines had dressed itself in light. Gold bulbs hung between the pine trees around the town square. Red ribbons twisted around lampposts. Children skated in wobbly circles on the small outdoor rink, their laughter rising into the clean blue air like bells. Booths sold hot cider, baked apples, waffles dusted with sugar, and paper cups of chocolate so warm that steam curled above them in little white ghosts. The whole town smelled of cinnamon, wood smoke, wet wool, and snow. From a distance, it looked like the kind of place people meant when they said, America still had small towns with good hearts. A white church steeple beyond the square, storefronts with painted signs, elderly couples walking carefully arm in arm, men in work coats stamping their boots near burn barrels, mothers fixing scarves around children's necks. But Brennan Cole knew better now. A town could look gentle and still be afraid. A town could smile while swallowing shame. He stood near the edge of the square in his old dark grey-black olive tactical shirt, moss-green combat pants, worn military boots, and battered watch. The cold had reddened the clean-shaven lines of his face, sharpening his square jaw and high cheekbones. His brown-white military-cut hair stirred slightly beneath the wind. To anyone watching, he looked still, controlled, almost emotionless. But inside him, everything was listening. Arthur stood beside him. The old man had not wanted to come. That morning, he had sat on the cabin bed with Evelyn's pocket watch in his hands, saying perhaps the town had suffered enough. Perhaps a project that brought jobs mattered more than a house one old man had failed to protect. Brennan had not argued. He had only said, "Then come see what they're building with your name." Now Arthur stood in the snow, wearing the brown-grey coat Nora had mended, a faded scarf tucked under his chin, his thin white hair combed back as neatly as his trembling fingers would allow. His face was pale, his shoulders small inside the old coat, but there was something straight in him that had not been there the day Brennan found him under the fruit stand awning. Sable stood close to Arthur's left leg. The 5-year-old German shepherd looked better after 2 warm nights and real food, though her yellow and black coat still carried the roughness of hunger and exposure. Her amber-brown eyes moved over the crowd, not suspicious of everyone, but aware of everything. Each time someone passed too near Arthur, Sable leaned lightly against his leg, not blocking him, only reminding him he was not standing alone. That small pressure seemed to keep Arthur on Earth. At the center of the square, North Star Basin Renewal had built a wooden stage. Behind it stood the field trailer. Only yesterday it had been a work trailer, plain and practical, hauled from site to site behind a heavy truck. Now someone had dressed it up with evergreen garlands, framed photographs, and a painted sign that read, "The Cole Orchard Heritage. Exhibit a new future for Coldwater Pines." The words made Brennan's stomach harden. There were old pictures of the orchard pinned to display boards, apple trees in summer, children holding baskets. A faded photograph of Arthur and Evelyn standing near the first row of saplings, both younger than Brennan was now. Evelyn wore a blue sweater. Arthur had one hand on her shoulder, shy even in a photograph. Arthur saw the picture and looked away. On the stage, Graham Voss smiled, as if he had personally arranged the sunshine. He was dressed for the role he had written for himself. Charcoal wool coat, black turtleneck, dark trousers, polished black shoes, thin leather gloves, and a grey scarf that looked soft enough to belong to a different world. His silver blonde hair was combed neatly back. His pale eyes moved over the crowd with careful warmth. Graham had the rare and dangerous gift of making greed sound like civic duty. Mara Finch stood near the side of the stage, half hidden behind a banner. The young environmental engineer looked as if she had not slept. Her brown hair was tied low, strands loose around her tired face. Her dark green North Star parka hung open despite the cold, as if the logo on her chest had begun to burn. She kept looking toward Brennan, then toward Deputy Iris Vale, then toward the trailer. Doyle Mercer stood near the trailer steps. He had both hands shoved deep into his work jacket pockets. His black knit cap sat low over his forehead, and his wind-burned face looked grey beneath the red. He did not meet anyone's eyes. A man could sign a statement and still be afraid of the truth once it put on boots and walked into daylight. Deputy Iris Vale waited near the edge of the square with one uniformed state investigator. The investigator was new to Brennan. Elliot Shaw, about 48, medium height, broad through the chest, with close-cropped black hair, a trimmed salt-and-pepper beard, and calm dark eyes. He wore a dark green state police winter jacket, black gloves and boots clean enough to show he had come from an office, but worn enough to prove he did not live only in one. He had the quiet manner of a man who preferred facts to speeches and had learned that small towns could lie with very polite faces. Iris stood beside him, compact and steady in her navy duty jacket, her auburn brown hair tied low, grey-blue eyes fixed on the trailer. Brennan knew they were waiting for one more confirmation. Doyle's sworn statement gave them a path. The recovered scan gave them context. Mara's informal account gave them concern. But Iris needed Mara to confirm, in front of an officer, that the trailer had been used for meetings about Arthur's land and that the recording equipment might contain relevant data. The law moved carefully. That made Brennan impatient, but careful was better than ruined. Graham lifted the microphone. "Friends," he began, his voice warm enough to melt suspicion, if a person wanted badly to be comforted. Coldwater Pines has always been a town of roots. Families who stayed, hands that worked, orchards that fed generations. Today we honor that past by building a future worthy of it. People clapped, not everyone, but enough. Graham spoke of jobs, visitors, restored trails, small businesses, winter tourism, youth returning home. He spoke of hope the way a banker spoke of collateral. Then he turned slightly toward the trailer. And no family represents that spirit more than the Coles, whose orchard will become the heart of this renewal. Arthur's hand trembled. Sable pressed against him. Brennan felt his father shift, and for one terrible moment he thought Arthur might collapse under the weight of hearing his own life used as decoration. And instead, Arthur stepped forward. Brennan reached for him. Arthur shook his head once. There were thresholds no son could carry a father across. Arthur walked slowly toward the stage. The crowd quieted in uneven ripples. Some people recognized him at once. Others recognized the discomfort around him before they recognized the man. Graham's smile faltered, but only for a heartbeat. Then he opened his arms slightly, pretending welcome. "Arthur," Graham said into the microphone, "what an honor. Would you like to say a few words about your family's legacy?" He meant to own the moment. Arthur took the microphone. His hand shook so badly that for a second Brennan almost stepped in. But Sable had moved with Arthur and now stood at the foot of the stage, looking up at him, ears forward, body still. Arthur looked down at the dog. Not the trailer, not the crowd, not Graham, and only an old man looking at the animal who had stayed beside him when every human story had been twisted, and somehow finding his own voice in the silence of her faithfulness. When Arthur spoke, his voice was thin. "I was ashamed," he said. The square went still. "I thought if an old man lost his home, then maybe the old man had been foolish enough to deserve losing it." Graham's expression tightened by a fraction. Arthur continued, "But being tricked is not the same as being stupid. Trust is not a weakness, and when a man studies where another man's heart is soft, then presses there until he signs, that is not progress. No one clapped now. No child laughed. Even the skates on the rink seemed to hush. Graham stepped closer, still smiling, one gloved hand reaching gently toward the microphone. "Arthur has had a difficult season," he said. "I think we all understand how emotion can cloud." Arthur turned toward him. "I remember what you told me." Graham stopped. "You told me I was protecting my son." The words cut through the square. Brennan saw Mara close her eyes. Doyle looked as if he might be sick. Iris straightened. Elliot Shaw's gaze moved from Graham to the trailer. Graham lowered his voice, but the microphone still caught the edge of it. "This is not the place." Arthur looked out at the town. "It became the place when you put my wife's photograph on that trailer." The crowd shifted. Brennan could feel something move through them. Not certainty yet, but doubt. Doubt had a sound. It rustled coats, changed breathing, made people stop looking at their shoes. Sable suddenly turned away from the stage. She did not bark. She did not lunge. She walked to Doyle Mercer. Doyle flinched. Sable stood before him, head lifted, amber eyes steady. The same silent gaze that had broken him the day before returned now under the bright festival lights. Doyle's mouth opened. For a second, he looked like a man trying to keep his job, his fear and his soul from tearing him into three different people. Then he stepped toward Deputy Iris Vale. "I'll say it again," he said, loud enough for those nearby to hear. Graham ordered the trailer moved before maintenance checked the recording unit. Mara stepped away from the banner. Her face was pale, but her voice was clear. The trailer was used for internal meetings about the Cole property. There may be recordings from before the final signing. Graham turned on her then. For the first time, the warmth left his eyes entirely. "You don't know what you're saying." "Yes," Mara said, trembling. "I do." "That's the problem." Iris moved. She did not rush. She did not perform courage for the crowd. She simply walked to the trailer steps with Elliot Shaw beside her and said, "This trailer is subject to temporary evidence preservation pending review." Graham's smile vanished. "You have no authority to turn a public festival into a spectacle." Elliot Shaw's voice was calm. "Then let's keep it from becoming one. Step aside." For one moment, Brennan thought Graham might refuse, but men like Graham survived by appearing reasonable. He stepped back, jaw tight, eyes cold. The trailer door opened. No one cheered. That would have made it too easy. The crowd only watched as Elliot Shaw, Iris, Harlan, Mara, and Doyle entered the trailer. Brennan stayed outside with Arthur. He wanted to go in. Every instinct in him wanted to see the thing opened, exposed, dragged out into the winter light. But Arthur's hand found his sleeve, so Brennan stayed. Minutes passed. The festival seemed suspended. A paper cup rolled across the snow. Somewhere a child asked a question and was hushed. Graham stood near the stage, looking not angry now, but calculating. Then Elliot Shaw stepped back out. He did not hold up a smoking gun. Life was rarely that generous. "We have located recording equipment and internal storage devices consistent with Ms. Finch's statement," he said. "Initial review confirms files exist from the relevant week. Full forensic review will be conducted off-site." Graham began to speak. Elliot raised a hand. One short audio segment was accessible during preservation verification. The square seemed to inhale. Elliot did not play it over the festival speakers. He was too professional for that. But he looked at Iris, then at Harlan, then at Graham. The segment includes a male voice discussing the need to secure Arthur Cole's signature before Brennan Cole returned to town. No one needed the whole recording yet, not for the town to understand. Graham's face remained composed, but the mask no longer fit. People began to move away from him. Only a few inches at first. Small distances, human distances. But it was enough. Arthur lowered his head, not in shame this time, in exhaustion. Sable returned to him and leaned against his leg. Iris approached Graham. "Mr. Voss," she said, "you need to come with us and answer some questions." "I will cooperate fully," Graham said. His voice was still smooth, but no one believed it was warm. As Graham was escorted toward the state vehicle, the winter festival lights continued glowing above him. Absurdly beautiful, little golden stars strung between trees. Coldwater Pines watched in silence as the man who had promised them a future walked past the old man whose past he had tried to steal. Arthur did not watch him go. He looked down at Sable instead. The dog's ears had softened now. Her body, still close to him, no longer braced against the crowd. For the first time that day, she looked tired. Arthur touched her head with a shaking hand. Then he turned to Brennan and spoke so quietly that only his son could hear. "I thought she was waiting for you to come save the house." Brennan swallowed. "Wasn't she?" Arthur's eyes filled, but his mouth held steady. "No," he whispered. "I think she was waiting for you to come home so I could stop hating myself." Brennan looked at his father, at the dog, at the town beginning to understand what it had almost helped bury. Then he put one arm around Arthur's shoulders. The square remained bright. The cider still steamed. Children stood silent on the ice. And under the clean winter sky, the truth did not roar. It simply stood there at last, visible enough that no one could pretend the snow had hidden it. After the winter festival, Coldwater Pines did not heal overnight. Truth rarely moved that quickly. The lights came down from the square. The skating rink emptied, the smell of cider and cinnamon faded from the streets. But something had changed beneath the snow. People no longer spoke of North Star Basin renewal with the same easy hope. They spoke more carefully now, as if every promise had grown teeth. Graham Voss was not dragged away in chains like a villain from an old storybook. Life did not give Arthur Cole that kind of simple theatre. Graham was questioned, then questioned again. His attorney issued a statement about misunderstanding, procedural confusion, and malicious emotional claims, but the words no longer carried the old magic. A polished lie was still polished, but now the town had seen the stain beneath it. The evidence moved slowly through proper hands. Elliot Shaw, the state investigator, preserved the trailer equipment for forensic review. He did not make speeches. He did not promise justice by Friday. He was a careful man, and careful men could feel maddening to those who had already waited too long. But Brennan respected him for it. Elliot's calm meant the evidence would not be wasted. A civil attorney named Olivia Trent took Arthur's case. Olivia was 53, tall and narrow, with smooth brown skin, silver-threaded black hair, pulled into a low knot, and eyes so steady that people often confessed more than they meant to under her gaze. She wore dark wool suits, plain pearl earrings, and winter boots that looked too practical for court, but exactly right for northern justice. Olivia had spent 25 years handling property disputes, elder exploitation cases, and contracts written by people who believed small print was a place to hide sin. She did not speak in grand promises. She spoke in timelines, affidavits, preserved evidence, and the quiet fury of a woman who had seen too many old people made to feel foolish for trusting the wrong voice. "This will not be clean," she told Brennan at Nora Bell's cabin, "but it is strong." Arthur sat near the stove while she explained it. Sable lay at his feet, her yellow and black body stretched along the warm floorboards, ears moving whenever Arthur shifted. Olivia laid out the chain. The recovered scan from the town photocopier showed Arthur had first been given a short survey agreement. Lena Pike's statement confirmed Graham had collected the early version and moved all further communication through North Star. Tom Arlen's pharmacy log showed Graham had picked up Arthur's medication on a crucial day. Mara Finch confirmed Graham knew Arthur did not understand the final packet. Doyle Mercer gave a statement about the trailer move and the order not to check the old recording unit. Reverend Caleb Wren confirmed Arthur had been displaced and sleeping at the church soon after the supposed orderly transfer, and then there was the audio. Not everything from the trailer was usable. Some files were corrupted, some had poor sound. But one recovered segment was clear enough. Graham's voice, speaking about getting Arthur's signature before Brennan returned and shaping the old man's fear around his son. Arthur listened once, only once. When it ended, he took off his glasses and folded them carefully. "I don't want to hear it again," he said. No one asked him to. He asked him to. The court hearing was smaller than Brennan expected. No grand hall, no packed gallery, just a county courtroom with pale walls, wooden benches, flags in the corner, and tall windows looking out at a frozen river. Judge Margaret Ellison presided from the bench. She was 67, with short white hair, a square face, and the kind of plain, unblinking attention that made performance look foolish. She had grown up on a dairy farm before becoming a judge, Olivia told them, and still had little patience for people who decorated dishonesty with expensive words. Graham sat with his attorney across the aisle. He looked composed, but not untouched. His charcoal coat was folded neatly beside him, his silver blonde hair combed back, his gloves placed in perfect alignment on the table. Yet Brennan noticed the small things now, the stiffness at the jaw, the way his fingers tapped once before stilling, the cold irritation in his pale eyes when Arthur entered. Arthur wore his mended coat, not a suit, not borrowed dignity, his own coat, his own scarf, his own trembling hands. Sable was not allowed inside the hearing room at first. That nearly broke Arthur's courage more than the sight of Graham did. But Olivia had filed a request for Sable to remain nearby as a support animal during Arthur's testimony. The judge allowed the dog to lie beside Arthur's chair, provided there was no disruption. Sable caused none. She simply lay there, chin on her paws, amber eyes open. Arthur testified slowly. He forgot one date, corrected himself once, asked for water twice. Graham's attorney tried to make those moments look like confusion. Olivia did not fight him with drama. She fought him with sequence. "Mr. Cole," she asked, "did you believe the first document allowed North Star to take ownership of your home?" "No." "Did you understand that the final packet included rights related to geothermal access?" "No." "Did anyone read the full final packet to you?" Arthur looked down at Sable. The dog lifted her head slightly, as if hearing a sound only grief could make. "No," Arthur said. "They told me it protected my son." That was the moment the room changed. Not because the judge gasped, not because Graham confessed. Nothing so theatrical happened. But Arthur's voice did not break. For the first time since Brennan had come home, his father spoke of what happened without sounding like a man asking forgiveness for being harmed. A temporary injunction came first. North Star was ordered to halt all work on the Cole property until the dispute was fully resolved. Equipment was removed. Access was restricted. The project's public partners withdrew pending review. Graham's companies began turning on one another with the quiet panic of men discovering there were not enough shadows left to hide in. Then came the formal ruling. The transfer was voided on grounds of misrepresentation, undue influence, and failure to establish informed consent. Further investigation into fraud and evidence handling continued through the state. Graham was not yet sentenced. That would take longer. But Arthur's home, legally and plainly, was his again. When Olivia called with the news, Arthur did not celebrate. He sat in Nora Bell's cabin, one hand resting on Sable's head, and stared at the floor. Brennan had imagined joy, relief, maybe tears. Instead, Arthur whispered, "What if the house hates me?" Nora Bell, who had been pouring coffee, stopped. Brennan felt the question go through him like a blade turned sideways. It was not a rational fear, but shame was rarely rational. Shame made objects into judges, chairs, doors, family photographs, empty rooms. "The house doesn't get a vote," Nora said, too briskly, but her eyes were wet. They drove back the next morning. No crowd followed, no one lined the road. There was no music, no speech, no triumphant procession. Only Brennan's black pickup moving slowly through a light snowfall, the heater blowing against the windshield, Arthur silent in the passenger seat, and Sable standing in the back with her nose near the cracked window. The road to the orchard looked wounded. The North Star fence had been taken down, but the holes remained where posts had bitten into the frozen ground. Tire marks cut through the snow. Mud had dried along the edges of the driveway. The apple trees stood bare and crooked beneath the winter sky, stripped of leaves, stripped of pretense, but still alive. Brennan stopped before the porch. The house looked tired. The front step had a fresh scar where something heavy had been dragged across it. One shutter hung slightly crooked. The lock had been changed back, but the door still bore the faint outline of the hardware North Star had installed. The curtains inside were uneven. The whole place seemed to have held its breath too long. Brennan got out first, then helped Arthur down. Arthur stood at the bottom of the steps with Evelyn's pocket watch in his hand. He did not move. Sable climbed from the truck and went to him. She did not pull, did not whine. She only pressed her shoulder lightly against his leg. Arthur took one step, then another. At the door, Brennan unlocked it and pushed it open. The house smelled cold, stale, and faintly of old wood. Dust floated in the pale light. Someone had moved the furniture, but had not understood where anything belonged. Evelyn's blue ceramic bowl sat on the wrong shelf. Arthur's old tools were boxed in the corner. A family photograph lay face down on the side table. Arthur stood at the threshold, shaking. Brennan did not enter first. Sable did. The German shepherd crossed the doorway with slow certainty. She moved through the living room, sniffed the leg of Arthur's old chair, circled once near the stove, then walked to the corner where the old wall clock stood silent. It was the clock Arthur had built for Evelyn on their 30th anniversary. Sable sat beneath it and looked back. Arthur made a small sound. The clock had stopped. Its pendulum hung crooked, knocked loose when the house had been emptied. Arthur walked to it as if approaching a hospital bed. His fingers trembled when he opened the glass front. For a moment, Brennan thought he would not be able to fix it. Then Arthur's hands remembered what his heart could not. He adjusted the pendulum, checked the weight, turned one small brass screw. His face changed, not healed, not young, but present. The old skill returned through his fingers like water finding a dry creek bed. The clock gave one uncertain tick, then another. Then the room filled with the soft, steady sound of time beginning again. No one spoke. The quiet miracle that was not magic at all. An old clock, a faithful dog, and a man discovering that the house had not been waiting to condemn him. It had been waiting to be set right. Arthur covered his mouth with one hand, then he wept. Not loudly, not in collapse. He simply stood in his own living room and let the shame leave him in small human pieces. Brennan placed a hand on his father's back. He did not say, "It's over," because it was not over. Arthur was still old. Brennan had still been gone too long. Sable still lifted her head sharply whenever a truck slowed near the road. The town still had apologies to make and pride to swallow. Graham still had legal consequences ahead of him. But there was firewood by the stove. There was a dog lying beside the old chair. There was a clock ticking in the corner. And there was a son who decided that leaving again could wait. Weeks passed. Brennan repaired the porch, replaced the locks, fixed the gutter, and drove Arthur to medical appointments. He called his father even when he only went to the hardware store for nails. Arthur pretended this was excessive. He also answered every time. Mara Finch resigned from North Star and stayed in Coldwater Pines to help the town design a smaller conservation plan for the orchard, one without hidden ownership traps or men selling hope by the pound. Lena Pike volunteered at the library every Saturday, reviewing basic documents for seniors before they signed anything. Deputy Iris Vale organized workshops on elder fraud and property rights. Harlan Creed came twice a month, grumbling about bad coffee while secretly enjoying the work. Coldwater Pines did not become perfect. No town did, but it became more honest. One late winter afternoon, Brennan found Arthur on the porch, and the sun came through bare apple branches and fell across his shoulders like powdered gold. Sable lay at his feet, sleeping deeply at last. In Arthur's lap was a small clock from Ellen Rourke's shop, its back removed, its tiny gears exposed. His hands still trembled, but when they touched the machinery, they knew where to go. Brennan leaned against the porch rail. "You think you'll be all right?" Arthur kept working for a moment. Then he looked at the orchard, at Sable, at the house that had taken him back without asking for an apology. "Not every day," he said, "but today I don't feel like a fool." Brennan nodded, because that was enough, more than enough. The true victory had never been only the land. It was an old man sitting on his own porch again, beside a dog who had never abandoned him, learning that a soft heart was not a defect. It was proof that trust, even when betrayed, was still worth protecting. And in a world that often rewarded the cruel for sounding clever, that was no small grace. This story reminds us that shame can make even good people feel alone, but love has a way of finding the door back home. Arthur did not lose his worth when he was deceived. Brennan did not lose his love because he came home late. And Sable, faithful through hunger, cold, and silence, showed us something deeply true. Sometimes God's mercy does not arrive with thunder. Sometimes it comes through a loyal dog, a remembered truth, a neighbor who finally speaks, or a son who chooses to stay. In everyday life, many people carry quiet burdens they never explain. A parent may say they are fine when they are not. A neighbor may need help but feel too ashamed to ask. Someone we love may be waiting for one phone call, one visit, one gentle question. So let this story remind us. Do not look away from the people who once stood strong. Check on them, listen to them, defend their dignity. And never believe that a wounded heart is foolish simply because it trusted. If this story touched you, please share your thoughts in the comments. Tell us where you are watching from, and if you believe stories of loyalty, faith, and second chances still matter, please subscribe to the channel and join us for the next story. May God bless you, protect your home, strengthen your family, and place someone faithful beside you in every hard season.